So today we're going to talk about AI and Neoteny. And not a lot of people know what Neoteny means. And it basically means delayed maturation, and that humans don't mature. And this is not unique to humans. It's just characteristic of how humans have evolved. And a more formal definition is it's the retention of juvenile features in the adult animals, and that how evolution can accelerate or slow down quickly with a few minor changes in genetics. And the features that you notice is the morphology of the body and the shapes of things, where they're characteristic of an infant growing to a teenager growing to an adult. The proportions of head and body and the shape of the head, for example, changes relatively gradually, but you can recognize not just in humans, but in other species, a juvenile individual from an adult. And there's a characteristic changes of shape and changes of behavior that we'll talk about that allows you to distinguish sort of the maturity of a person. And the AI looks at these kind of things and judges age and maturity level, but also things like behaviors change along with this. And this is something that was noticed, I think, roughly in the 70s or so, about the maturation of other primates, where on the left is an infant chimpanzee and the adult chimpanzee is next to it. And the infant chimpanzee looks a lot more like a human than an adult mature chimpanzee, in terms of brain body or head to body ratio, but also other features of the face and characteristics of the body. And one way to evolve is to slow down the clock that regulates some of these changes, like the head body ratio. So if that clock were just running slower, the infant could mature into an adult, but with the shape characteristics of the infant intact. And one of the theories of how humans evolved from other primates is just simply slowing down the clock that says how fast your body matures. And the time goes by in the regular way, but the body stays in juvenile state through adulthood and death. And this has other bits of evidence where an adult chimp, not only does the skull and other things grow, but the teeth, for example, grow, where in an adult human, these things look a lot more like the infant chimp. And so even a juvenile chimp looks a lot like an adult human as well as a juvenile human. And so neoteny is the term for how evolution works in this way, and how the juvenile traits are retained into adulthood. And this has effects on many things, but it's an obvious evolutionary comparison in that the divergence from chimps to humans has happened relatively rapidly in evolutionary timescales, a few million years. And modifications to DNA take a longer amount of time. And it means a small number of modifications to the DNA made apparently a big number of changes in the shape of a human and the maturation of a human. And the likely explanation is that the aging clock slows down. And so we talked recently about space aliens and people's hallucinations of space aliens, and the sort of head to body ratio and the eyes to face ratio, which are actually quite a lot like a fetus of a human. And so built into our brains are the circuits to recognize other creatures like ourselves, which are very important to the survival, especially of a fetus or of an infant, to recognize who's another human and who's not, and who's friend who might help and might not. And the other thing that this changes is the brain to body ratio, where this is a chart of the brain-body ratios of a number of different species. And you can see male and female humans on there, and that their head-to-body ratios are among the highest on this chart. But other species like dolphins and crows and bats have a relatively larger head compared to their body size. And then creatures like lions have a relatively smaller brain compared to their body size. And of course, dinosaurs had quite small brains compared to their body size. And part of what makes for a bigger brain is having a bigger body with parts of the brain dealing with the larger size of the body. But if in the extreme cases, the animals that have a bigger brain relative to their body tend to be smarter. And those that don't, from dinosaurs to goldfish, aren't considered as smart generally. And so this morphology shape change happens in a lot of different species, where to distinguish what's an infant from what's an adult. And much of this has to do with availability for breeding. And are they fertile to breed? And can you see that from across a meadow, or when they're hiding in a bush or whatever? That is that an adult or a child? And this also changes with sexual dimorphism and the changes that happen after puberty, in that the secondary characteristics like pubic hair and armpit hair and beards and other things change to signal when an individual has reached breeding maturity. And these are relatively subtle in humans, but in other species, they can be fairly dramatic. Not only when you've age-wise matured to fertility, but when you might be ovulating or in estrus or whatnot. And so this is the case in humans, but if humans were to keep growing to 150 or 200 or 300 years, these extra developmental characteristics like body hair would likely continue to grow. 200-year-old human might have a lot more body hair than a 40-year-old human. And other changes happen in the developmental stages, and that both are that symbol fertility and symbol breeding maturity, but also are kind of fashions, and that what's considered a beautiful male or female, it has lots of details of eyebrow shape and cheek shape and things that are relatively subtle in various developmental stages of humans. But when you look at, say, other primates, you can see where these things are working on the same mechanism. And so these are symbols of pre-breeding fertility, and thus kind of attractiveness. And this goes in fashion cycles over evolutionary time. In certain parts of the world, people favor a certain kind of hair versus another. And in other parts of the world where it's maybe better for survival, some of these things are different, say Nordic countries from equator closer countries. And so this is the biological mechanism of neoteny, which is a slowed maturation that leads to a different species. And humans aren't the only ones that this happens. A classic example is wolves being selectively bred to create dogs. And dogs are basically wolf puppies that mature more slowly. And so they die before they become an adult in a differentiated way. And so basically this happened because people separated the wolf puppies from the wolf tribes and lived with the wolf puppies. And if a wolf puppy matured too fast, either behaviorally or shape-wise, the humans would get rid of it. And so it's created two different designs from the original wolf, where not only do dogs look like wolf puppies, but they behave like wolf puppies too. And if you were to take a dog and put it in the wild like a wolf, it wouldn't live very long. And if you were to take a wolf and have it sleep in your bed and eat your food, it might live a more comfortable life. But its behavior is something that has been bred out of dogs that would normally be in wolves. And bred out meaning that the dogs just die more or less sooner than their maturity would, that's already in their genetics, would support. And so the things that change like a puppy wolf into an adult wolf in shape and behavior are slowed down in a dog such that the dogs physically will die before it gets the aggressive behavior or the longer snout or other things that are characteristic of wolves. And these things are a combination of inherited traits that are the shape and behaviors that are inherited genetically, and then learned behaviors, which are the social upbringing. And so a dog could learn to be more wolf-like, and a wolf could learn to be more dog-like. But there's the inherent behavioral characteristics that are genetically coded that can be overridden by learning. But in a social type creature, sort of education, either by parents in the wild or by more structured education, affects the genetics. And so what's bred with what is affected by both the inherited traits and the learned traits. And so some of these behaviors can be very complicated. Like here's a male, a pheasant, I believe, courting a female. And they go through they have genetic characteristics, but they also have behaviors that are trying to impress the female who's not very impressed. The people are more impressed than the female. But these kind of things, like whether that female decides to mate with that male, depends on how fancy his feathers are and how well it dances. And so it's not a sure thing, though. So this is a combination of physical and behavioral. And then some of this is subconscious and some is conscious. And like in dogs, for example, how much of the dog mating behavior or call, if you like that term, is conscious between the dogs, and how much is the female ignoring the male? Is it a game, or are they waiting for some threshold movement of feather to say, okay, that you're good enough? And some of these behaviors are learned. For example, in lions, the behaviors, they act out theatrically drama, where when a lion cub bites an adult lion, the adult lion pretends to be in great pain to teach the baby lion that, well, biting is good. But as the baby matures, not too much biting. And so these are complex physical and behavioral things that are learned in animals as well as in people. And people have their genetic characteristic behaviors, like fear of snakes or spiders, for example, is probably genetic and not necessarily learned. But other things are learned by teaching, either from a family or eventually schools and religions and so forth, that teach you behavioral characteristics that maybe match or don't match your genetic behaviors. And so these, like in humans, just like in geese and lions and whatnot, some of the behaviors of an adult are learned from the genetic family, and then the tribe, and then the culture. And this evolves into essentially religion, which teaches people rules around breeding. And then as governments get involved, the religion teaches more or less rules around breeding, and the government teaches rules around social cooperation. And those two things have been found to be good to separate in modern governments and religions. But they both are an important part of learning. And a relatively new thing, just in the last 100 years, is essentially media, which for the previous 75 years, media has pretty much been one direction. It's coming at you as a replacement for books. But in the last 20 years, media has become bidirectional, where with things like YouTube and social media, where you receive information, but also you respond back. And now it can be much more personalized and customized to you personally, not just your genetics, but also your developmental stage and your unique characteristics, which maybe you're dyslexic, or maybe a super math whiz, or maybe you have a musical sensibility. And the things that you learn from the media can be highly personalized to where you are, not just in your developmental stage, but where you are today. Are you sleepy, or do you have coffee, or that can be continuously adapting. And this adaptation is basically AI that's learning where you are and learning where people like you at your stage are most receptive to learning new things. And so it's an evolution of behavior and where it starts to interact with AI. And so what people are teaching and what they're learning is also a fashion where at the same time on the same planet, in some parts of the world, what's appropriate behavior, dress around breeding in particular, is largely regulated by religion. And some religions take perhaps valid, that everything should be covered, and other religions say everything should be exposed, or that there's one particular thing that is the most relevant. And so this varies around the world and is mostly regulated by religion and changes, of course. And so some of it is cultural, where the traditional grandmas would say, this is not appropriate here, or this is better. And then the fashion changes, like this is Kanye's latest outfit and latest wife. And you see they've made subtle changes to the shapes of their bodies to show sexual dimorphism and even role type plays. So it's a more rapidly moving set of behaviors and appearances that, well, if you see Kanye hiding in a bush or across the field, you can judge whether they're likely sexually mature or not, and whether you should run or you should go seek them out based on their shape. And so this is the sexual dimorphism, where males and females are identifiably different between genders, and you can judge things like fertility and so forth, like before and after. And then there's things like puberty, which is the biochemical maturation into fertility, where at the time puberty is starting to kick in, you also have ego kicking in, which is something that the mind and body of the developing individual needs to develop a stronger sense of self to say it's not its parent. And so you don't get an issue with inbreeding of, even though your sex hormones are raging, your ego says, that's not me. And that can extend not just to parents, but to siblings and to closely related individuals. And people have an instinctual level of separation from potential breeding partners that wouldn't be good evolutionary. And some of this happens in many different species, and some is enforced by religion and religion rules of who is appropriate to breed with or not, and whether they're related to you genetically or from a different tribe. And so most successful breeding partners are obviously not genetically closely related to you, but they're not too distant either. So when you're selecting a mate, the dimorphism is part of it, but there's other factors like how they smell, how they taste, how they look, how they behave, where you're judging whether they're appropriate to mate with or not. And so one of the reasons for this neoteny adolescent type of mode that we're in, of staying in this experimental, searching, highly charged breeding mode, is that adolescents are fairly tuned to taking risks and expending energy and experimenting and playing with things. And that kind of behavior, whether it's a puppy or an adolescent human or a young wolf, they can adapt to a changing ecosystem. And maybe they're living in a snowy climate or living in a deserty climate where things are changing. And so they need to adapt their behavior to deal with a changing ecosystem. This probably leads to a shorter life because they're taking risks and they're dying accordingly, but they're more likely to adapt to a changing environment than to a static environment. And so the identity of who you are is not just physically, but it's who you are behaviorally and maturation-wise, and deciding that's me, where your closest relatives are partly me, they're genetically closer to you, and that's not me. And so these kind of things define your identity, not only physically, but behaviorally. And then you have an immune response, not just the taste and smell and look of somebody, but also their behavior, their mind, body. And so these are both intrinsic, not really changeable. And then there's how you display yourself. So some of the controversies about displayed gender or a gender preference, or even what race somebody is or what they choose to be, comes into play. And a conservative approach would be say, these are very binary. There's only two ways, and they're determined at birth, and they're not flexible. And that's not likely the case. For example, if somebody chooses to express as a certain gender, they can still breed biochemically, but their preference of who they identify as and who they might want to socialize with is not necessarily binary. For example, in the sort of homosexual preference people, their gender is defined, but for example, gay men are more likely to be the younger siblings of heterosexual cis brothers, older brothers. And so why, if a homosexual person can't breed with another homosexual person, why does natural selection and nature even allow that to exist? And one of the reasons is people who identify or are a close relative, if their life is actually helping the survival of their siblings better, and then helping the survival of their siblings' offspring better, that lineage will survive better than if they didn't have that help. And so there's reasons why non-breeding individuals can be very valuable to the survival of a certain lineage of genetics. And so this is what religions and so forth also wrestle with, is how to survive better. And so then there's some downsides to this. For example, like breast cancer is an example where it's a recently developed physical characteristic trait that from a small number of genetic changes, likely in clocks, to continue to grow breast tissue faster than other tissues of previous ancestors. But growing tissue is what cancers are. And so when you have some particular trait that's favored for breeding and appearance, it's changing genes to turn it off to continue growing when otherwise they aren't necessary, except for aesthetics. This also creates a risk that it'll continue growing too much, which is like a breast cancer theory. And then, of course, in social species, the individual is not all important, because the humans, like bees and ants and killer whales and other creatures that are social, they're a lot more able to survive as a group than they are as an individual. And there's a saying like it's an African saying, that if you want to go fast, you go alone. And if you want to go far, you go together as a group. And an individual human is basically prey, but two or more humans or a group are basically predators. And so there's this push-pull of the survival as a group is better in humans than the survival as an individual. And the individuals aren't all necessarily equal, not just in humans, but in other creatures. Lobsters, for example, have a hierarchy based on size and maturity and other things. And humans have adopted that, and that's since agriculture, there's a monogamy hierarchy, where for the last 12,000 years or so, control of land is something that you can grow crops, you can have more children, you can survive better. And so the control of the land is a really important survival mechanism. And what's evolved in humans is to say controlling the genetic lineage of who controls that land is what defines the survival of the offspring. And so that's monogamy hierarchy, where you want to have clarity as to what is the genetic lineage of the individuals that control that land, where a genetic hierarchy is a little bit more of the same thing, but not attached to the land. Hyenas or gorillas or other creatures, the bigger, stronger ones are the dominant ones, but they're not necessarily the most prolific breeders. And that this is, for YouTube's sneaky heifers, are something that is characteristic in a number of kinds of birds and other animals, where The alpha male controls the group, but the ones who actually breed more are the beta males who use the opportunity created by the alpha male to breed with inconspicuously with the others. Or there's even some females as well. There's birds who appear to be monogamously mating, and they were studied for decades as being pair bonded monogamously, sharing a nest and all these kind of things, until they had genetic sequencing, and they found out the poster children for monogamy in birds, when they had 3 eggs in their nest, and the people who studied them watched them every day, so there was no chance for them to have mated with anybody else. It turns out 1 or 2 of the 3 eggs were from some other male, and they couldn't figure it out until they started to watch them all night. And it turns out, like a couple hours before sunrise, the female would fly over to some other nest, mate with the male there, and come back. But the biologists who were studying this, they didn't show up until sunrise. And so there's the social group breeding behavior that's obvious, and then there's the more subtle one that actually gets more genetic diversity, and that works. And so these are all, so morality and monogamy and things of this nature, they're not unique to humans, and they're not specific to religion. It's just religion is built around this kind of thing. And so the behavior, whether you're complying with the religion or not, is, are you in or out of the tribe? And the reason to be out is if you're not compliant, or if you're out of the tribe trying to come in, you're a stranger and you're a risk. And so that's, people for good reason have fear of that. And that's would be true of packs of dogs or hyenas or schools of fish or whatever. And so these practices change. And in the case of more complex social structures like humans, some of these practices become law. And it's law or rules that are enforced either by a religion or by a government or by both. And the laws have some concept of facts, where one of the definitions of a law is it's based on the finding of facts of, did you follow the rules or not? And the rules are a consensus reality, and the legal trial or the religious trial is, are you violating the consensus reality or not? And as I mentioned, this has changed with agriculture, but it's not necessarily the only strategy or the optimal strategy for procreation of humans. And then there's the element of pleasure, where the pleasure element and the hormonal drive to breed creates a drive where in many species, say chimpanzees, they only are in estrus fertile for a short period of time, a few days of the month. And they have a strong drive to breed at that time. And the breeding partners know that's the time they're receptive. And so they are breeding primarily for procreation. And in bonobos, though, for example, compared to chimps, the bonobos will breed many times of the month, or they'll interact sexually many times of the month, as opposed to when the female is specifically fertile. And humans are a lot more like that the fertility is actually concealed, and the relationship between the individuals can be reinforced by the drive to interact sexually and the pleasure that comes from it, that creates a bonded pair that will raise the offspring more successfully. And then they also stay as a group better because of the closeness of them, and the group will take care of the offspring better than individuals. And so traditional religions say the Greek gods wove sort of sexual behavior and passions and into the mythologies of the different gods. And that was something that there were multiple gods and they all were playful, but the relatively recent 5,000 years of monotheistics, which is one God, has started to change that to be a little bit more favoring the agricultural requirements from the hunter-gatherers. So there we have social species and other things of this nature. But the religions have evolved into, there's around 4,000 religions, many of them monotheistic, but some of the people, particularly those in these religions, believe that 3,999 of the religions are wrong and their choice of religion is the right one. And just from a logic point of view, that's unlikely to be the case. And then of those 4,000 religions, on any particular topic, you can find two different religions that have completely opposite views on whether you should eat fish on Friday or any given topic. So it doesn't pass the logic test, but the purpose of the religion is cohesive, trusted behavior. And that's one definition of what is the purpose of life. And it's not leading a religious moral existence. It's more find things to do that you love that create a meaningful existence. And so there's other little related things that science is a form of play to discover an unknown puzzle. And this turns out to have survival benefits because you can invent things like airplanes and stuff. And then the part of play is laughter. And humans aren't the only creatures that laugh. Primates do, but dogs and other creatures laugh in various ways. And that the main thing is it's a group cohesion of playing together like adolescents, infants that are developing connections with the other individuals. And it's not a top-down tyranny of rules to follow. It's more play with the rules and an infinite game kind of way and develop a cooperation that works as the environment changes. And so the last of this kind of slide is that AI is starting to weave its way into being essentially a major part of the media and of religion and of governments, potentially becoming the major drive of these things, which means they learn and they customize to the situation. So it's not a general rule. It's not like one Bible for everybody. It's everybody gets a Bible that's custom for them. And so this is a trend where AI is starting to likely influence these characteristics of neoteny in humans and breeding behaviors and so forth. And the information that the AIs have now is largely based on information written by humans, where it's pretty faithful to what a human thinks, feels, and the emotional feeling part of language. But as AI writes more and more of the movie scripts and government laws and enforces religions, that the rules of AI become a little bit more totalitarian, and that'll affect how AI affects our mating and breeding behaviors. And one of the things that's gotten pendulum too far is a lot of media now, and increasingly governments and religions, are running based on advertising or money. And that advertising, pretty much the goal is to get people to consume. And so this is causing media to mostly be something that holds your attention while you get ads to go buy stuff. And so that's a problem. And then it's a worse problem if there are people who have an economic incentive but are anonymous, trying to influence your behavior. And so it's a bit of a broken system. And some that are still, an example would be, say, Hollywood, where movies are becoming long advertisements, or public broadcasting, which is supposedly funded by the government to be a neutral point of view, is starting to run brought to you by a big oil company and fast food company. And so the advertising is starting to influence whether the media is giving information about working together or giving you information about what to consume. And one of the things that's trying to hold the line on that is Wikipedia, which is saying no advertising on Wikipedia, and that the people who edit Wikipedia are self-policing, saying, let's try to have the objective information without a bias, where most of the other forms of media and elections influenced by money and religions influenced by money are getting into a consumption point of view. based on the way the money incentivizes people. And so when AI becomes more monetized, and it's not clear how it's best to monetize AI now, if it's advertising based, it'll have the same disease of pushing for consumption. And then this is like bad for the ecosystem. And who knows what it does for breeding and evolution and such things. But then how this applies in how AI fits into this, who your friends are and what kind of media you like and who you even match with and date or are friends with is being influenced heavily by AI algorithms now, where who you show up as the best mating match for you on something like Match.com is as an algorithm, and the algorithm is related to your identity, and an AI is deciding that for you. And so there's your own choice, but it's starting to be influenced by AI. And then there's also a push-pull in things like social credit scores and identity, and things like national identity. Are you a citizen or not? And are you the person who's making that, and what's your qualifications? And so like in China with the social credit score system, or the US with our credit source system, it also starts to regulate who you associate with and thus who you breed with and what and how people are educated. And so these are starting to influence society, but they're also likely influenced by the same algorithm that's driving neoteny. And a nanny state government would much rather clearly identify who are its citizens and rank them and decide who are the most compliant. And so the AI who controls the money and the conversation can affect who you breed with and what the population becomes. And then it's algorithm versus algorithm in natural selection as to what will survive better. And so and that includes down to the language. Do you speak Chinese, or do you speak English, or do you speak French? And these things are increasingly being monitored by algorithms which censor things. And then the question is, our relationships with people may get more complicated as people have more and more relationships with AIs, and not necessarily a breeding relationship, but it's a meme breeding relationship if you're spending a lot of your time talking to an artificial entity. And Facebook they didn't announce, but they hinted that some of the people on Facebook will be AIs that you can become friends with and have chats with and so forth. And the relationship you have won't necessarily be with only people. You'll have relationships, like it or not, like with your automated telephone helpline or whatever. So there's a bunch of thoughts about how neoteny is starting to drift into AI, and AI is starting to drift into affecting our breeding and relationships. Okay, so there we have neoteny. Don't grow up. So.